In 1953, a single toy company in Hillside, New Jersey, earned more than $32 million selling miniature trains. It was the largest toy manufacturer on the face of the earth. Not just in America, the world. Walk through any American neighborhood on Christmas morning during the 1940s and 1950s, and you would hear it before you saw it. That familiar electric hum, the small whistle, the tiny clatter of metal wheels on three-rail track. You step inside the living room, past the decorated tree, and there it was, circling beneath the branches, silver and red and gleaming, a Lionel train. 5,000 workers labored inside the Hillside factory on Sager Place, their hands assembling the locomotives, freight cars, and signal towers that would become the defining gift of an entire generation. The catalogs alone, those full-color dream books of illustrated locomotives, were mailed to millions of homes each year. Poured over by boys who pressed their noses to the pages and circled everything they wanted. The trains were not toys. They were portals. They were the sound of American industry rendered small and safe and endlessly thrilling. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Across more than 6 decades, until the company that had defined Christmas morning in America found itself passed from hand to hand like an unwanted inheritance, sold to a cereal company, stripped down by cost cutters, abandoned to bankruptcy court, rebuilt by a rock and roll guitarist, and dragged through millions of dollars in legal battles that nearly destroyed it forever. Today, Lionel still exists. It is headquartered not in New Jersey, not in a great factory humming with workers, but in a modest office in Concord, in North Carolina. Its trains are designed in America and manufactured in Asia. The old factory at 28 Sager Place in Hillside sits silent. So how does the greatest toy company America ever produced end up orphaned, stripped of its birthplace, bankrupt twice, twice, and passed through the hands of nearly a dozen different owners? How does a name synonymous with childhood joy become a case study in corporate mismanagement, legal warfare, and cultural abandonment? Actually, this is the story of Lionel Trains. 3 acts: the rise of an electric empire built by a Jewish immigrant son in New York City, the peak of a golden decade when Lionel ruled Christmas, and the long, painful fall that turned a national treasure into a cautionary tale. Welcome inside the factory where American childhood was built and nearly destroyed. Hello, everyone. Before we make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Now, let's go back to a New York City street corner in the year 1900, where a young man with big ideas and a small electric motor was about to change everything. 1877. New York City. Joshua Lionel Cohen was born on August 25th of that year in Queens, the 8th of 9 children raised by Hyman Nathan Cohen and his wife Rebecca. Jewish immigrants who had traveled from Germany to build a new life in America. The family was not wealthy. The apartment was crowded, but the boy who would one day change Christmas morning for millions of American children had something most boys did not: a mind that could not stop asking how things worked. At the age of 7, he attached a small steam engine to a wooden locomotive he had carved himself. The engine exploded and damaged his parents' kitchen, and it was the first of many experiments that would define his life. He enrolled at Columbia University and the City College of New York, studying electrical engineering with the intensity of a man who believed electricity was the future of everything. In 1899, he received his first patent, a device to ignite a photographer's flash using electrical current. That same year, the United States Navy awarded him a defense contract to produce mine fuses, earning him $12,000. It was a fortune for a young man in his 20s, but it was not trains. Not yet. Cohen was observing the shop windows of Manhattan when the idea found him. The displays were static, dull, motionless. He began tinkering with a small motor he had originally attached to a blade to make a battery-powered fan. He connected that motor to a miniature car. He set it on a small track, and the car moved. In the year 1900, Cohn and his business partner Harry C. Grant incorporated the Lionel Manufacturing Company at 24 Murray Street in New York City. The official paperwork was dated September 5th, though it was not filed until September 22nd. In December of 1900, the company's first product was delivered. It was called the Electric Express. A simple open wooden boxcar painted red, stenciled with gold lettering, moving on brass track powered by a battery. Cowan, who would legally change his name from Cohen to Cowan in 1910 to avoid the anti-Semitism that shadowed Jewish businessmen of the era, had designed it not as a toy, but as a store display, a moving object to draw customers' eyes. Then something happened that nobody expected. A Manhattan shopkeeper bought the Electric Express to dress his window. His customers immediately began asking where they could purchase the moving train for themselves. The shopkeeper ordered 6 more. Word spread. Now, Lionel sold 12 of those first trains in total. 12. That was the entire first run. But in those 12 sales was an idea that would eventually build one of the greatest manufacturing empires in American history. The idea that people did not just want to watch the train go around the track. They wanted to own it. They wanted to run it themselves. 1906, Irvington, New Jersey. The Lionel Manufacturing Company was outgrowing itself. The original workshop on Murray Street had been replaced once already, the company moving to White Street in 1904 as sales climbed. By 1910, they had moved again to White, this time to New Haven, Connecticut, lured by tax incentives from a chamber of commerce eager to attract industry. Then in 1915, Joshua Cowan, weary of the commute, moved the operation again to Newark, New Jersey. Each relocation was a testament to the same truth. Demand kept exceeding the company's capacity to supply it. By the end of the First World War, Lionel was one of 3 major toy train manufacturers in the United States. The others were American Flyer and Lewis Marks and Company. The competition was fierce. American Flyer offered smaller, lighter trains that hobbyists praised for their realism. Marks undercut everyone on price. And Lionel? Lionel played a different game entirely. Cowan convinced department stores across the country to incorporate his toy trains into their Christmas displays, not on shelves, but circling beneath the great decorated trees at the center of the store's floor. Hundreds of shoppers would watch the trains loop around, children tugging their mothers' coats, fathers leaning in for a closer look. By the time a family left the store, the children were already asking. By December 25th, Lionel was under the tree. The genius of this strategy cannot be overstated. Cowan did not just sell a toy, he embedded his product into the ritual of Christmas itself. His trains were deliberately built larger than those of his competitors. They looked like a better value. They were sturdier, heavier, more imposing. When customers compared them on the shelf, Lionel simply appeared superior, even when it was not always the most technically accurate model. Cowan advertised directly to boys, positioning Lionel as the ultimate masculine toy. He advertised to mothers, emphasizing safety and durability. He turned Christmas catalogs into objects of desire. Full-color illustrations of elaborate layouts that boys would study for hours. In 1929, Lionel opened its great factory at 28 Sager Place in Hillside, New Jersey. It was a cathedral of industry, a sprawling facility that would eventually expand multiple times over the coming decades, was growing in 1940, 1941, 1950, and 1952. The factory sat beside a spur of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. Lionel's engineers would record the sounds of passing freight trains to perfect the company's famous air whistles. Every detail mattered. Every detail was deliberate. But here's the thing about great factories and great momentum. They require an enemy to sharpen against. Lionel found its in the Ives Manufacturing Company. By 1928, Lionel's fierce advertising campaigns had bled Ives dry. Ives filed for bankruptcy. Lionel and American Flyer bought the company jointly, and by 1932, Lionel owned it outright. One rival down. 1934. Hillside, New Jersey. The Great Depression had arrived like a storm that refused to pass. By 1930, Lionel's operating profit had collapsed from more than $500,000 in 1927 to a mere $82,000. In 1931, the company recorded a loss of $207,000. The numbers continued to deteriorate. By May of 1934, Lionel entered receivership, a gentler word for the edge of ruin. The questions facing Joshua Cowen were existential. In a country where men were selling apples on street corners and standing in bread lines for miles, who was going to spend money on a toy train? The answer, it turned out, was determined by how you sold the thing. Now, Cowen made a decision in 1934 that seemed at the time either brilliant or desperate. He partnered with Walt Disney to produce a hand-painted Mickey Mouse wind-up handcar. The car featured Mickey and Minnie Mouse pumping the handles, moving around a circular track. It sold for $1. In the depths of the Depression, families who could not afford a full train set could afford $1. The Mickey Mouse handcar sold 300,000 units. Well, it did not save Lionel entirely, but it kept the lights on long enough for the storm to pass. Then came another move. By 1939, Lionel had recognized that its large, expensive standard gauge trains, the grand models that had defined the 1920s, were no longer what the market wanted. The Depression had changed the psychology of the American consumer permanently. People wanted something smaller, less expensive, more practical. Yeah, Lionel discontinued its standard gauge line entirely and concentrated its resources on O-gauge, a smaller format that would eventually become the company's defining product. It was a painful decision. Thousands of molds and tools were made redundant. But it was the right one. In 1942, the decision was made for Lionel entirely. The United States entered the Second World War, and Lionel was ordered to halt civilian toy production. The factory at Hillside was converted to produce nautical equipment and compasses for the Navy. Lionel made nothing it would sell in a store for 3.5 years. The assembly lines stood differently arranged. The workers assembled different things, but the knowledge, the tooling, the expertise, all of it was preserved. Then came 1945. The war ended. The soldiers came home. And what they came home to was a country that had been saving up its hunger for normalcy for years. A country that wanted Christmas trees and children and miniature trains running beneath the branches. Lionel was ready. The factory retooled. The lines started again. And what came next was nothing short of extraordinary. 1948. Hillside, New Jersey. Walk through the factory at 28 Sager Place in the post-war years, and you would see 5,000 workers at stations stretching the length of multiple city blocks. Women and men bent over assembly benches, fitting tiny motors into locomotive shells, soldering wires so thin they caught the light, painting detail onto freight car sides with steady hands and practiced patience. The smell of machine oil and warm metal hung in the air. The sound was constant, the rhythmic percussion of production that never quite stopped. In 1948, Lionel released the model that would define an era. Yet the Santa Fe F3, catalog number 2333, was an electromotive diesel locomotive finished in the Santa Fe Railway's iconic war bonnet paint scheme, gleaming silver and red, with a yellow stripe and the black lettered herald of the railroad along its flanks. It was not just accurate. It was beautiful. Children who saw it in the catalog and in department store displays did not merely want it. They ached for it. Sales climbed through 1949, 1950, and then higher still. In 1953, Lionel recorded revenues of more than $32 million. its highest figure ever. Company historians and outside analysts declared, in that same year, that Lionel had become the largest toy manufacturer in the world. The claim was disputed. Rival marks sold more than $50 million in total toy revenue in 1955. But for the O-gauge train market, Lionel dominated absolutely, outselling its closest remaining competitor, American Flyer, by nearly 2-1. The products kept evolving. In 1950, Lionel introduced magnet traction, embedding magnets into the wheels of locomotives to improve their grip on the track. It was presented to boys as a technological marvel and to fathers as practical engineering. Steam locomotives puffed real smoke, produced by dropping small tablets into the smokestack where a heating element vaporized them. The effect was astonishing for its time. Remote control uncoupling allowed operators to uncouple freight cars from across the room. The trains were not just toys. They were small machines. And owning one felt like being in command of something real. And the catalogs. Those extraordinary full-color catalogs that arrived in the mail every autumn, illustrated with elaborate layouts and locomotives rendered with a brushwork that made them seem almost edible. His boys would circle the items they wanted with pencils and leave the catalogs in conspicuous places for their parents to find. The Lionel catalog was its own cultural event, the unofficial start of the Christmas season in millions of American homes. Cohn understood what he had built. He called his trains a way to make a boy feel like a man and a man feel like a boy. He was right. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We're only halfway through the story, and the most dramatic moments are still ahead. 1957, Hillside, New Jersey. The year began with what appeared to be another triumph. Lionel released the Model 746, a stunning recreation of the Norfolk and Western Railway's J-Class steam locomotive. Many collectors would later call it the finest post-war Lionel ever produced. The detail was extraordinary. The performance reliable, the design among the most beautiful the company had ever achieved. It sold well. But Lionel was not watching its competitors carefully enough. While the company perfected its O-gauge 3-rail trains, a different format was quietly gaining ground across the American hobby market. HO scale. Smaller than O-gauge, more realistic in proportion, less expensive to manufacture and purchase, was drawing a new generation of enthusiasts who valued accuracy over grandeur. European manufacturers had been producing superior HO models for years, and American hobbyists were taking notice. The market was shifting, and Lionel, comfortable in its dominance, was slow to react. In 1957, the company scrambled to respond. Lionel licensed a line of HO scale trains from the Italian manufacturer Rivarossi and rushed them to market. The quality was inconsistent. The line did not integrate seamlessly with the premium image Lionel had spent 50 years building. Collectors noticed. The line struggled. It was the first sign that the company's instinct for the market, so sharp during the Cohn years, was beginning to dull. Meanwhile, the culture was changing beneath Lionel's feet. The launch of Sputnik in October of 1957 redirected the imagination of an entire generation of boys away from railroads and toward rockets. Space sets, astronaut figures, and missile launchers were suddenly the toy category every manufacturer was racing to develop. Lionel tried to adapt, releasing a set in 1959 that included a military flat car carrying a missile launch system. It felt like a company in costume, not quite comfortable with where the culture had gone. The problem was deeper than products, though. Joshua Lionel Cohn was 80 years old. He had run this company for nearly 6 decades, and the fire was going out. His relationship with his son Lawrence had frayed into something close to estrangement, a dispute over succession and control that left the company leaderless at exactly the moment it needed direction most. By the end of 1958, Lionel recorded a net loss of $469,000, the company's first yearly loss since the Depression. Sales on the year were $14.5 million. In 1953, they had been $32 million, and the fall had begun. And nobody at the top seemed to know how to stop it. 1959, New York City. In the summer of that year, a syndicate of investors led by Roy Cohn, attorney, political operative, and grandnephew of Joshua Lionel Cowan, began quietly purchasing shares of the Lionel Corporation. By October, Cohn and his associates controlled the company. Joshua Cowan, who had sold his 55,000 shares at $15 each, did so without informing his son Lawrence. Lawrence was traveling in Asia at the time. When he returned and learned what his father had done, he sold his own shares to Cohn as well and resigned. He would later sue the company for failing to pay his consulting fees, eventually settling. He died in 1970 at the age of 63. His father outlived him by 5 years. Roy Cohn was not interested in toy trains. He was interested in leverage, diversification, and the acquisition of electronics companies that might win government defense contracts. From the start, he replaced most of Cowan's management team with his own men. He added subsidiary companies to the Lionel portfolio that had nothing to do with trains. Dale Electronics, Sterling Electric Motors, Telerad Manufacturing. He formed a partnership with the Porter Chemical Company and introduced a line of science kits under the brand Lionel Porter. Chemistry sets, microscope sets, geology and physics kits, cataloged from 1961 to 1968. Meanwhile, the train line itself suffered. Quality control declined. New products were introduced cheaply and without the careful development that Cowan had demanded. In 4 years of Cohn's leadership, the Lionel Corporation lost $13 million. $13 million for a company that had been generating $32 million in revenue less than a decade earlier. The damage was staggering. In 1963, Cohn was forced to resign after losing a proxy fight, shareholders rising up against a chairman who had nearly destroyed the company they had invested in. But the damage he left behind was deep. Former Army General John Medeiros had been brought in as president in 1960 to attempt a turnaround and failed. The executives who followed him failed as well. The company was renamed the Lionel Toy Corporation, a rebranding that satisfied nobody. Then something happened that might have looked like an opportunity, but was actually a death blow in slow motion. In January of 1967, the A.C. Gilbert Company, parent of Lionel's longtime rival American Flyer, went bankrupt. In May of that year, Lionel purchased the American Flyer brand name and product line for $150,000. It was a bargain. It was also a trap. The company lacked the capital to develop or market the acquisition effectively. Less than 4 months after buying American Flyer, Lionel filed for bankruptcy itself. August 7, 1967. The electric empire had gone dark, and Joshua Lionel Cowan, the man who had built it, had died 2 years earlier in Palm Beach, Florida, on September 8, 1965. He was 88 years old. 1969. Mount Clemens, Michigan. The Lionel Corporation did not disappear after bankruptcy. It survived as a holding company, eventually pivoting toward a chain of retail toy stores on the East Coast known as Lionel Leisure World. But the trains, the heart of everything Cowan had built, were sold off. In 1969, the tooling for Lionel's train product line was purchased, and the Lionel brand name was leased to Model Products Corporation, a subsidiary of General Mills, the breakfast cereal company whose boxes contained Lucky Charms and Cheerios. By 1970, Lionel Trains were being produced in a new factory in Mount Clemens, Michigan, under the MPC label. The era that collectors would come to call the Fundimensions years had begun. General Mills was a competent manufacturer of many things. Toy trains were not at the top of that list. The cost-cutting measures introduced under MPC were extensive. Metal parts were systematically replaced with molded plastic. The fine detail that Cowan's workers had applied by hand was simplified into molds that could be stamped out by the thousands. The trains ran. They were reliable in the basic sense that they circled the track without failing, but they were not what Lionel had been. Collectors noticed the difference immediately, and they were not forgiving. In 1973, Lionel was absorbed into General Mills Fundimensions Group, a subsidiary dedicated to hobby and educational products. And the slogan the company adopted during this period was "Not just a toy, a tradition," a phrase that acknowledged the brand's history while doing relatively little to honor it. The factories in New Jersey were gone. Production moved further from its roots. Then came 1982, and a decision so poorly conceived that it still provokes anger among Lionel enthusiasts decades later. General Mills relocated train production from Michigan to Mexico. The reasoning was economic. Lower wages, yet reduced overhead. The result was a quality disaster. Trains produced in Mexico during 1982 and 1983 were widely regarded as the worst in the company's history. The machinery was inadequate. The quality control was insufficient. Veteran Lionel collectors, some of whom had been buying trains since the post-war golden years, were furious. Some stopped buying entirely. Production returned to Michigan in 1984, the Mexican experiment quietly abandoned. In 1985, General Mills sold its toy divisions, and Lionel was absorbed briefly by Kenner Parker. The brand had now changed hands 3 times in 16 years. It had gone from the world's largest toy manufacturer to a division of a cereal company to a subsidiary of a toy conglomerate without anyone who truly cared about the trains sitting at the top of the organization. But the name still meant something. And in 1986, a man who understood exactly why arrived to claim it. 1986, Detroit, Michigan. Richard P. Cohn was a Detroit-based real estate developer with a personal fortune and a lifelong passion for model trains. He had been collecting Lionel since childhood. He understood the product not as an executive studying a balance sheet, but as someone who had loved it for decades. In 1986, Cohn purchased the Lionel brand from Kenner Parker and formed Lionel Trains Incorporated, LTY. And for the first time since Joshua Cowan had sold his shares in 1959, someone who genuinely cared about trains was running the company. The results were immediate. Cohn invested in quality. He introduced a line called Lionel Classics in 1988, which directly reproduced the great metal trains of the 1920s and 1930s. The standard gauge behemoths that collectors had been hunting at antique shows for years. And he also pushed the technological frontier. In 1988, Lionel introduced Railscope, a locomotive fitted with a miniature video camera in the nose, transmitting a live engineer's eye view to a television screen. It was years ahead of its time. Then in 1989, the company introduced Rail Sounds, a microelectronic sound chip placed inside locomotives containing exact digital recordings from full-size trains. The locomotive's whistle, bell, and steam sounds were no longer approximations. They were the real thing, captured and miniaturized. The first engines to carry rail sounds were the Pennsylvania B6 scale switcher and the Reading T1 Northern. Collectors responded with an enthusiasm that had been absent for years. But the most transformative development of the Cohn era came not from inside the company, but from the most unlikely of partners. In 1992, Richard Cohn was approached by a musician who was also an obsessive model railroader. His name was Neil Young. Young had been building elaborate layouts on his California ranch for years, driven by a motivation that went beyond hobby. His son Ben had been born with severe cerebral palsy. Ben could not grasp traditional transformer controls or push accessory buttons. So Neil Young had begun engineering solutions, modifications, custom controls, and a large paddle that Ben could activate by pivoting his head. that would let father and son operate the trains together. Young and Coogan founded a joint venture called Liontech Incorporated, chartered to develop new model train control and sound systems. The partnership would change the technical landscape of model railroading permanently. Here's what nobody saw coming. A rock and roll guitarist was about to become one of the most important inventors in the history of toy trains. 1994. Northern California. Neil Young maintained a 3,000 square foot barn on his property dedicated entirely to model trains. Inside it, 2 antique train cars of full size sat alongside the elaborate O-gauge layout he had constructed over years of sleepless nights. Nights spent planning the track layout while pacing with his infant son Ben, whose cerebral palsy caused him pain that only constant movement could soothe. Young would walk and think, visualizing the flowing curves and mainline straights of a layout that would one day give his son a way to engage with the world around him. The result of Liontech's work was unveiled in 1994, the Trainmaster Command Control System, TMCC. It was a technology that permitted the operation of multiple Lionel locomotives simultaneously on the same 3-rail track, using a wireless remote control. For the first time, an operator could walk around an entire layout, could stand at the far end of a room, and still control every locomotive on the track. Speed, direction, sound effects, whistle, bell, the diesel roar and steam chuffing, electro-couplers, all accessible from a handheld device. Young had paid for the development out of his own pocket. For Ben Young, the Trainmaster represented independence. A large red button, custom built by his father, could be operated by the pressure of a head movement. Hence, the trains that had been inaccessible to Ben were now his to command. Play with the layout became the primary way a father and his disabled son communicated. The emotional origin of one of the most commercially successful products in Lionel's modern history was as simple and human as that. In 1995, Coogan sold Lionel Trains, Incorporated, to a new investment group. The buyer was Wellspring Capital Management, led by Martin Davis, former chairman of Gulf and Western and Paramount Communications. Neil Young joined the transaction as a minority partner with a 20% stake, ensuring that his technological work would remain inside the company he had helped transform. The new entity was renamed Lionel, LLC. Meanwhile, the commercial momentum was building. The Polar Express, a 1985 children's book by Chris Van Allsburg about a magical train journey to the North Pole, had been beloved for a decade. When Warner Brothers announced it would adapt the book into a major animated film starring Tom Hanks, scheduled for release in November of 2004, Lionel prepared a train set to coincide with the release. Nobody knew what was coming. What came was the single most important commercial event in Lionel's modern history. Then something happened that threatened to end the company before the Polar Express could save it. We're deep into this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. And the most explosive chapter is just ahead. April 2000, Columbia, Maryland. MTH Electric Trains, founded by Mike Wolfe in Columbia, Maryland in 1980, had grown from a small operation into a serious competitor in the O-gauge market. Yet Wolfe was passionate, exacting, and aggressive in protecting what he considered his intellectual property. In April of 2000, MTH filed a civil lawsuit against Lionel in federal court, alleging trade secret misappropriation. The claim was specific. One of Lionel's South Korean subcontractors had obtained MTH's locomotive design drawings through a shared designer and used them to produce locomotives for Lionel. Criminal proceedings had already taken place in South Korea, resulting in convictions. The lawsuit moved slowly through the courts. In April of 2004, the trial finally convened in Detroit, Michigan, before a jury. The evidence included thousands of engineering drawing pairs, sets from both companies that MTH's expert claimed showed systematic copying. The jury deliberated and returned its verdict on June 7, 2004. Lionel was found liable. The damages awarded to MTH were $40 million. $775,745. Lionel announced it would appeal. 2 weeks later, on November 15, 2004, the company filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. In its filing, Lionel listed $55 million in debt and $42 million in assets. Its largest secured creditor was PNC Financial Services Corporation, owed $31 million. Yet the MTH judgment was not even included in the $55 million debt figure. It floated separately, like an additional catastrophe waiting to land. The CEO, who had been running the company, Bill Bracey, was dismissed in September of 2004, along with 17 other senior employees. He was replaced by Jerry Calabrese, a former Marvel Entertainment and NASCAR executive who had never worked in the toy train industry. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific Railroad sued Lionel in May of 2004 for trademark infringement, claiming Lionel had been putting Union Pacific's logos on its models without a license. Lionel eventually settled that suit in September of 2006 for $640,000 plus future royalties. Lionel was simultaneously fighting a bankruptcy proceeding, a trade secrets appeal, a trademark lawsuit, and a rapidly depleting cash reserve. The company that Cohen had built on the premise of bringing joy to children was now a defendant in multiple courtrooms. Here's what nobody saw coming. While all of this was happening, a single Christmas movie was about to throw Lionel a lifeline. November 2004. Hobby shops across America. The Polar Express, directed by Robert Zemeckis and starring Tom Hanks in multiple roles, premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival on October 13, 2004, and opened in theaters nationwide on November 10th. The film told the story of a young boy who wakes on Christmas Eve to find a great black steam locomotive waiting outside his house, the Polar Express, bound for the North Pole. It was nostalgic, magical, and aimed directly at the emotional intersection of childhood and trains. Lionel had produced a train set to coincide with the film's release. The catalog number 6-31960 Polar Express ready-to-run set. Featuring a 284 Berkshire steam locomotive lettered as the 1225, a number chosen because it matched the real locomotive on which the book's artist had based his illustrations. The set came with passenger cars whose window silhouettes depicted scenes from the movie, a 40 by 60-inch oval of Lionel's Fast Track, a brass bell, character figures, and a transformer. The suggested retail price was $229. Yes, demand obliterated the initial production run within days. Dealers sold out. Customers began calling shops and finding nothing. On eBay, sets appeared with buy-now prices of $449, nearly double the retail price. News outlets ran stories about desperate parents hunting for the set across multiple states. It was the Cabbage Patch Kid and the Furby compressed into a single holiday. With a company that was simultaneously in bankruptcy court trying to keep itself alive, Lionel ordered an additional production run and told customers it could not deliver until March of the following year. Parents waited. The second run sold too. By November of 2006, Lionel had turned a profit of $760,000 on total sales of $55 million. The company was not recovered. It was still in bankruptcy, still fighting MTH, still carrying its debt. But the Polar Express had done something invaluable. It had demonstrated that Lionel still had cultural power, that the name still meant something to ordinary families who had never heard of O-Gauge or TMCC or rail sounds. The train was still, in some part of the American imagination, Christmas. That same year, 2006, Lionel received another kind of validation. The company's electric train was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame alongside the Easy Bake Oven. the first electric toy ever to receive that distinction. In the depths of bankruptcy, Lionel had been declared a national treasure. December 2006. Federal Appeals Court. On December 14, 2006, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the original MTH jury verdict, citing legal errors in the trial, specifically the improper admission of expert testimony and an improperly calculated damage award that the appeals court determined had double-counted MTH's losses. A new trial was ordered. This was the lifeline Lionel's lawyers had been fighting for. The $40 million death sentence was not erased, but it was suspended. On July 26th of that same year, the Lionel's bankruptcy judge had already ordered the company to submit a reorganization plan within 75 days of the appeals court's ruling. The plan that emerged was ambitious. Private equity firm Guggenheim Partners agreed to contribute $37.1 million to the reorganized Lionel Company, acquiring 48.6% of the new entity. What is via the estate of the recently deceased Martin Davis, who had led the Wellspring purchase in 1995, contributed an additional $21.9 million for a 28.6% stake. Together, Guggenheim and the Davis estate were injecting $59 million into the reorganization, plus an additional $10 million in second lien debt. All creditors would be paid in full. On March 27, 2008, Judge Burton Lifeland of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court in New York approved the reorganization plan. Lionel's chief executive, Jerry Calabrese, stated the company would be out of bankruptcy within a week. The settlement with MTH, whose details were sealed by court order, was reported by the Associated Press to involve a cash payment of $12 million. A separate patent claim from MTH involving smoke-puffing technology was also resolved in the same settlement. Neil Young's 20% stake did not survive the reorganization. His equity was wiped out by the terms of the deal, though Calabrese insisted Young would maintain an advisory role in the company's high-end legacy products. On May 1, 2008, Lionel emerged from Chapter 11. The company had been in bankruptcy for 3 years and a half months. But here's the thing about companies that survive a near-death experience. They are rarely the same afterward. The manufacturing plant in Mount Clemens had already been closed in 2001. Production had moved to Korea and then China. In 2021, it would move to Vietnam. The last American factory was gone. The workers who had assembled Lionel Trains for generations, the descendants, in a sense, of the 5,000 who had labored in Hillside, were out of the business. 2004, Irvington, New Jersey. On the evening of April 5th, 2004, the same year Lionel went to trial against MTH and filed for bankruptcy, a fire broke out in a vacant building at 603 to 621 South 21st Street in Irvington, New Jersey. 100 firefighters were called to extinguish the blaze. The building had been empty for a decade, its roof deteriorating, its floors hollow. It was the factory where Lionel had manufactured its trains from 1920 to 1929, the plant that preceded Hillside. Fire Chief Don Huber noted the building was in a state of advanced disrepair. By morning, much of it was gone. The Hillside factory at 28 Sager Place had fared somewhat better, at least structurally. It had been expanded 4 times during its peak years, 1940, 1941, 1950, and 1952, until it was a complex of interconnected buildings with a distinctive saw-toothed roofline designed to maximize natural light and ventilation. By the late 1960s, production had already been winding down there. The factory closed formally, not long after General Mills took over the brand in 1969. The building that had held 5,000 workers, that had vibrated with the sound of locomotive production 6 days a week, it was eventually abandoned and sold. Meanwhile, the last American factory, at 50,625 Richard W. Boulevard in Mount Clemens, Michigan, closed in 2001 when production was outsourced entirely to Asia. The corporate offices, which had been maintained at 26,750 23rd Mile Road in Chesterfield, Michigan, eventually became available for lease as well, as of the spring of 2017. Yet the building where Lionel executives had worked for years was listed as a rentable commercial space. The brand itself survived and even grew. In 2013, Lionel introduced its Lion Chief system, bringing wireless remote control to starter sets at accessible price points. In 2016, the company re-entered the HO scale market for the first time since 1990, producing a Polar Express set in that smaller gauge. In 2020, the HO lineup expanded substantially, and in 2010, Lionel entered an entirely unexpected new business. A joint venture with NASCAR Team Properties brought the company into the die-cast vehicle market. Production of 1-24 and 1-64 scale NASCAR models. By 2013, Lionel had acquired full ownership of that operation and named it Lionel Racing. A train company was now also a racing collectible company. Joshua Cowan would have found it baffling, but the name was alive. Whatever form it took, the name endured. 2025, Concord, North Carolina. Lionel LLC operates its headquarters from a building in Concord, North Carolina, a city best known as the home of Charlotte Motor Speedway. The irony of a train company headquartered next to a NASCAR track is not lost on anyone familiar with the company's history. From its offices here, Lionel designs products that are manufactured in Vietnam and sold through a network of hobby shops, department stores, and 2 company-owned retail locations, one at Concord Mills Mall, just miles from headquarters, and another at Opry Mills in Nashville, Tennessee. The company still dominates the O-gauge market. According to reorganization papers filed in 2007, approximately $70 million in O-gauge trains are sold annually across all manufacturers. And Lionel accounts for roughly 60% of that total. The math is significant. 60% of a category that Lionel itself largely created, maintained over more than a century despite 2 bankruptcies, multiple ownership changes, and the near collapse of the hobby. The Polar Express train set remains the company's best-selling product more than 20 years after its initial introduction. It sells reliably every holiday season, sold to families who may not collect trains at all, who may not own a single other piece of Lionel equipment, but who want the blue and black locomotive circling beneath their Christmas tree in November. The connection between Lionel and Christmas, the bond that Joshua Cowan forged by convincing department stores to place his trains beneath their holiday trees a century ago, has outlasted everything. It outlasted bankruptcy. It outlasted the loss of the factory. Yet it outlasted the lawsuits and the ownership changes and the years of cost-cutting and quality decline. In 2021, the company moved its final manufacturing from China to Vietnam, continuing the long migration of production away from American soil that had begun in the early 1980s. No Lionel train is manufactured in the United States today. None has been for more than 2 decades. Meanwhile, in hobby shops across the country, the post-war trains, the ones made in Hillside between 1945 and 1969, continue to appreciate in value. A rare 1949 black Lionel 2360GG1 brought $15,000 at auction in 2016. Collectors who know the history know that what they are preserving is not merely a toy. It is a fragment of the era when America made things. When 5,000 workers in New Jersey assembled Christmas morning for the entire country and the Santa Fe F3 and Warbanet colors made every boy feel like the engineer of something magnificent. The question that remains is whether the name alone, without the factory, without the workers, without the American soil beneath it, can carry that weight forever. Walk past 28 Sager Place in Hillside, New Jersey, today. Yet the great saw-toothed factory roof is gone. The factory where 5,000 workers built Christmas morning for an entire generation is a memory attached to a building that has long since found other purposes. The Lehigh Valley Railroad spur that once delivered raw materials to Lionel's loading docks no longer carries trains. Yet the American whistle that Lionel engineers recorded from passing freight locomotives, the whistle that wound up inside every steam engine from the post-war golden years, has been replaced by digital audio files assembled in an office in North Carolina. If you visit the hobby shops that still carry Lionel today, you will find trains of extraordinary quality and technological sophistication. Wireless remote control, digital sound systems, the camera-equipped locomotives, transmitting video to tablets. The product is, in many technical respects, better than it has ever been. And yet something essential has migrated out of it. The way heat migrates out of a building when the furnace is turned off. What the story of Lionel Trains teaches, told across 125 years of American history, runs deeper than any single lesson. The first truth is about the fragility of succession. Joshua Lionel Cowan built one of the most beloved brands in American commercial history, and then handed it in secret to a man who had no love for the product and no understanding of what made it matter. Roy Cohn destroyed $13 million and 4 years in a company that had taken Cowan 6 decades to build. The greatest threats to an empire built on passion are heirs who possess neither the passion nor the competence to honor what they have inherited. Every family business, every founder-led company carries this risk in its bones. The second truth is about the danger of standing still while the culture moves. Lionel dominated the 1950s because it understood what American boys wanted. It missed the 1960s because it could not understand that American boys were now dreaming of space instead of railroads. The companies that believe their products are timeless are the ones most likely to be left behind. Nothing is timeless. Everything must earn its relevance in every new generation, or watch that generation turn away. The third truth is about the power of a name and its limits. Lionel survived bankruptcy twice. It survived the loss of its factories, the outsourcing of its production, the migration of its headquarters, the erosion of its workforce. It survived because the name carried enough emotional weight to outlast every practical failure. But a name that lives only in nostalgia is a name on borrowed time. The Polar Express saves Lionel every Christmas, and that is remarkable. Whether it is enough, across the decades ahead, remains unresolved. 125 years of operation, $32 million in peak annual revenue in 1953, 2 bankruptcies, more than a dozen ownership transitions. The last American factory closed in 2001. Today, a 60% share of a $70 million O-gauge market, operated from an office in North Carolina, yet products manufactured in Vietnam. What is left is the name, the whistle, the memory of a boy lying on a living room carpet on Christmas morning, watching a silver and red locomotive circle beneath the tree, his father kneeling beside him to adjust the transformer. That boy is a grandfather now. He still has the trains in the attic. He still remembers the sound. The question American industry has never quite answered, and Lionel's story forces into the open, is whether memory, however vivid, it is enough to keep something alive forever, or whether there comes a morning when even the most beloved whistle finally falls silent.